A millionaire is moved by a young woman on the street, but the final reveal will shock you. Amidst the hustle and bustle of New York City, George McAllister, a successful millionaire, crosses paths with Rachel, a young woman determined to save something she loves that's on the verge of collapse. The unexpected encounter awakens something in George that he hasn't felt in a long time, the desire to make a difference beyond the business world. But with the place about to close and dozens of children depending on help to survive, Rachel's fight seems impossible. Will they be able to save everything in time? Get ready for an emotional journey of overcoming, hope, and transformation. George McAllister was a millionaire businessman admired by many but also feared. He had a commanding presence and was known for being ruthless in his dealings. His chain of luxury hotels, spread across the world, started humbly with a small inn in New York. Over the years, he built an empire through hard work, strategic vision, and great ambition. Although his name was synonymous with success, George felt something was missing. The luxury and prestige that surrounded him didn't seem to fill the growing emptiness inside. At 50, he found himself increasingly distant from the simple things that motivated him when he was younger. What once was a passion for building something big now felt like routine. He often wondered what had led him to this sense of emptiness. It was as if each achievement had lost its shine, and his life, despite being luxurious, was marked by a lack of purpose. He tried not to think too much about it, diving into work and numbers, but dissatisfaction was always a shadow in his mind. On an ordinary day, George decided to take some time for himself and walk around New York, the city where it all began. He wanted to breathe in the city air and remind himself of the early days of his journey. Walking through the busy streets and feeling the chaos of the big city made him feel alive. He saw the tall buildings, the headlights of the cars, and the constant movement of people rushing somewhere. However, something different caught his attention as he crossed a crowded avenue. A young woman, visibly tired, was handing out leaflets at a corner, trying to talk to pedestrians who ignored her. George, used to observing the world through a business lens, noticed that the woman didn't give up despite the indifference around her. She kept offering the leaflets with determination, even though few paid attention. Intrigued by her effort, George approached, took a leaflet, and began reading. The leaflet talked about an NGO that helped children in vulnerable situations. He looked back at the young woman and noticed that, despite being tired, she had a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Do you have a minute to hear more about our work?" the young woman asked with a gentle yet firm voice. George, accustomed to being approached by people interested only in money, was surprised by the sincerity in her tone. He agreed to listen. The young woman, who introduced herself as Rachel, began talking about the NGO her father had founded almost 10 years earlier. She explained that since his death, she had been struggling to keep the organization alive, but the challenges were mounting. As George listened to Rachel, he noticed something different about her. There was a passion in her words that touched him unexpectedly. He realized that this young woman wasn't just trying to raise money. She genuinely believed in the cause she was fighting for. The NGO offered more than just shelter. It was a place where vulnerable children found hope, education, and emotional support. George knew what it was like to fight to build something, but Rachel's struggle seemed much more personal, much more intense. He looked at the leaflet in his hand and found himself reflecting on what it meant to fight for something bigger than business. Rachel continued explaining that the NGO was facing severe financial difficulties. The rent was overdue, resources were running out, and if she couldn't get more support soon, her father's work would be lost. George, still absorbing the story, realized that this was more than just a cause. It was a matter of life and death for the children who depended on that shelter. For the first time in a long time, he felt something stirring inside him, a feeling he couldn't describe. As Rachel spoke, George could see how emotionally invested she was in her work. Her voice trembled slightly as she talked about the risk of losing the building, but there was also an evident strength in her words. She was someone who didn't give up easily, and that impressed him. He recognized determination when he saw it, and Rachel clearly had it in abundance. Even in such a difficult situation, she refused to abandon the NGO. That touched something deep within George. George, accustomed to dealing with numbers and carefully calculated strategies, felt a shift inside. It wasn't common for him to feel emotionally involved with something unrelated to his business. But Rachel's cause and the way she fought for it made him see life differently, if only for a moment. He knew that despite living a successful life, something was missing. And maybe, just maybe, helping this young woman could fill that void he had felt for so long. Before leaving, he looked at Rachel again and made a promise to himself. He would find a way to help. Even though he didn't know how yet, George knew he couldn't ignore the situation. That walk, which had started as a simple attempt to ease the weight of his routine, was about to change the course of his life in a way he couldn't imagine. Rachel watched as George pocketed the leaflet and looked around. She had no idea who he was, but she hoped he might be interested in the cause. The fact that he had stopped to listen to what she had to say was already rare. Most people walked by without even paying attention. Although she didn't know exactly what to expect, Rachel felt a glimmer of hope. It was rare for someone to show genuine interest, and she needed all the help she could get. The NGO was in a critical situation, and she knew that time was running out. With the rent overdue and donors disappearing, the organization couldn't sustain itself much longer. Rachel had dedicated the last few years of her life to the NGO, and the thought of losing it was devastating. She didn't want to disappoint her father, who had founded the organization with so much love and dedication. He believed that every child deserved a second chance, and she believed in that too, but keeping everything running seemed like an impossible task. As Rachel looked at George, part of her wanted to believe that he could be the solution. Maybe he knew someone who could help, maybe he had contacts or ideas. Anything would be useful at that moment. She was exhausted, fighting against a tide of difficulties, but still determined not to give up. Rachel knew that if she didn't find a solution soon, the shelter would close and the children would be left without support. And that was the last thing she wanted to happen. "I won't lie," Rachel said, looking at George with a tired yet sincere expression. "We're about to lose everything. The rent has been overdue for months, and the landlord has already made it clear that he won't renew the lease. We've held campaigns, events, and reached out to local businesses for help, but nothing seems to work. No one wants to get involved in something that, in their eyes, doesn't offer a return. The children we help don't attract attention or donations like other more popular causes." George listened in silence, processing every word. He knew what it was like to deal with crises, but he had never faced a situation like this. As Rachel spoke about the lack of support and the frustration of trying to keep everything afloat, he could see the emotional burden it placed on her. It wasn't just a matter of money. It was a matter of saving lives, of giving children a chance they otherwise wouldn't have. And that was something George had never considered in his business life. "What happens if you lose the building?" George asked, wanting to understand the consequences. Rachel sighed, clearly affected by the thought. "If we lose the building, the children who depend on us will have no shelter. Many of them came from abusive homes or were abandoned. This is the only place where they feel safe. I can't let them go back to the streets. But with the time and resources we have now, I don't know how to prevent that." Rachel's words echoed in George's mind. He had seen many companies go bankrupt, but this was different. It wasn't about bankruptcy. It was about lives that would be destroyed. He felt a weight he had never experienced before. What was at stake here wasn't just money, but the future of dozens of children. And as George thought about it, he began to see the situation in a way he never had before. Perhaps money wasn't the only solution. "Have you tried getting help from big investors?" George asked, wanting to better understand the situation. Rachel shook her head. "Yes, but the truth is that many don't want to get involved. For them, the return isn't attractive. We're not offering something that can be sold or promoted. We're trying to save lives, and unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be enough for some. People think our cause is noble, but few are willing to actually do something. Rachel's response left George deep in thought. He knew how the world worked. Big investors always looked for something that could bring benefits, either financial or for their image. But he also knew that there was more at play here. Rachel's cause was much more than a simple donation request. She was fighting for something real, for lives that would be transformed if the NGO could survive. George began thinking about how he could help but knew he needed to see the situation firsthand. I'd like to visit the NGO, see with my own eyes what you're doing. Maybe after that, I can think about how to help, George said with a firm but respectful tone. Rachel was surprised by the offer but accepted immediately. She knew that showing the work they were doing was the best way to convince someone to help. And who knows, maybe George could be the answer to her prayers. The next day, George arrived at the NGO as agreed. As he entered the building, he was immediately greeted by a mix of sensations. From the outside, the building looked worn and abandoned. The walls were dirty, with peeling paint and signs of leaks. The floor was stained, and there was a general sense of neglect in the place. But at the same time, there was an energy in the air that he couldn't ignore. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls, and the movement of the children created a striking contrast with the physical condition of the building. Rachel waited for him at the entrance, visibly nervous but excited. She knew that this visit was a chance to show George the real impact the NGO had on the children's lives. She greeted him and led him on a tour of the facilities. As they walked through the corridors, George observed everything attentively. He saw the children running, laughing, playing with the few toys they had. Despite the precarious conditions of the building, the environment seemed vibrant, full of life. The first stop was the study room, where some children were focused on their schoolwork. Volunteers were there helping, and George noticed the care and attention each child received. It was evident that despite all the difficulties, Rachel and her team did everything possible to offer a welcoming and safe environment. He was reminded of his own childhood when he also had to fight for education and opportunities. Touched something deep within him. As they walked, Rachel shared the stories of some of the children who were there. Many had gone through traumas hard to imagine. Some children had been abandoned by their parents, while others had suffered abuse or violence. George listened in silence, absorbing the information. He had dealt with complicated situations in his professional life, but nothing that compared to these stories of survival. Every child there had faced something no human should have to endure. George noticed a particular girl sitting alone in a corner, staring out the window. "Who is she?" he asked, curious. Rachel looked at the girl and answered, "That's Lily. She's 8 years old and lost her parents in a car accident. Since then, she barely speaks. We're trying to help her open up, but it's a slow process." George watched the girl for a moment, feeling a tightness in his chest. Lily seemed lost in her own thoughts, isolated from the world around her. As the tour continued, George began to understand how important the NGO was. It wasn't just a shelter for the children. It was a place where they could start to rebuild their lives. He saw the effort that Rachel and her team put into every detail, from educational activities to the emotional support they provided. Even with limited resources, they were making a real difference in the lives of these children. And that was something he couldn't ignore. At the end of the tour, Rachel and George sat down in a small meeting room. The environment was disorganized, with papers scattered everywhere. George looked around and realized how overwhelmed Rachel was. She was trying to do everything on her own, and it was clearly taking a toll on her emotional health. "You're doing an amazing job, Rachel, but I think you need more support. You can't do this alone," George said sincerely. Rachel smiled, grateful for George's words, but she knew he was right. "I know, but it's hard. We don't have many resources, and most people aren't interested in helping. I feel like I'm fighting against a growing tide," she said, her voice tired but still determined. George sat in silence for a moment, thinking about what he could do. He knew that just throwing money at the problem wouldn't be enough. The NGO needed a long-term solution. "I think I can help, but it's going to require some planning. Money will help in the short term, but we need to think about a way to ensure the NGO keeps running in the years to come. If you're willing to work on this, I think we can find a solution together," George said with a more decisive tone. Rachel looked at him, surprised but also relieved. Maybe, finally, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. With George's determination to help, the two began working together to find a solution. George knew that to ensure the future of the NGO, they needed to think beyond immediate donations. It was necessary to build a solid foundation, something that could sustain the organization in the long term. He began using his business experience to help Rachel organize the NGO's finances and create a strategy to attract more donors. However, as they worked on the plan, new difficulties arose. The building's landlord, impatient with the overdue rent, announced he wouldn't renew the lease. The news was a devastating blow to Rachel, who was already overwhelmed with so many responsibilities. In addition, an anonymous complaint brought government inspectors to the NGO. They claimed that the building was in dangerous condition and that if the necessary repairs weren't made, the place would be shut down. Rachel was on the verge of collapse. She had dedicated her life to the organization, and now everything seemed to be falling apart. "I don't know if I can continue," she said in a moment of despair while talking to George. "It feels like the more I fight, the more problems arise. Maybe it's time to accept that I can't save this on my own." Rachel was visibly shaken, her words carrying the weight of years of struggle and sacrifice. George, however, wasn't willing to let her give up. He knew how important the NGO was, not only for Rachel but also for the children who depended on that place. "You can't give up now, Rachel. You've already done so much to get this far, and I'm here to help you. We'll find a solution together. These children need you, and the world needs this place," George said, with a firmness that sparked a flicker of hope in Rachel. Maybe there was still a way out. With George's help, things started moving quickly. He used his business contacts to find architects and engineers who could renovate the building and ensure it complied with government regulations. At the same time, he began reaching out to potential donors and investors who might be interested in supporting the NGO. George knew it would be a race against time, but he was determined to do everything he could to save Rachel's work. The following days were intense. George and Rachel worked tirelessly to ensure the NGO could continue to operate. The building's renovation began, and the engineers worked day and night to meet the deadlines. Meanwhile, Rachel started recording testimonials from the children, following George's advice. She knew that to attract more donors, she would need to show the real impact the NGO had on the children's lives. It was a period of great pressure, but Rachel felt that with George's help, they were finally on the right track. At the same time, Rachel faced her own internal fears. The pressure of keeping the NGO running, the responsibility for the children, and the constant feeling that everything could collapse at any moment left her on the edge of exhaustion. But even in the most challenging moments, she remembered her father's legacy. He had started the NGO with a dream, to give children a chance at a better life. And Rachel refused to let that dream die. While George continued to work tirelessly, he not only brought in investors and financial resources for the NGO, but also began restructuring the entire operation. He knew that if they wanted to survive, they would need a solid business plan. The NGO had to be run like a company, with financial transparency and clear goals. George implemented systems to ensure that every donation was well utilized and that the results were clearly communicated to donors. But as the renovation progressed and new partnerships emerged, a shadow still loomed over the NGO: the final government inspection. If the building didn't meet safety standards, the NGO would be temporarily shut down. This would mean that the children would be left without shelter, and all the work they had done would be jeopardized. Rachel and George knew they had to race against time to make sure everything was ready for the inspection. In the days leading up to the inspection, the tension was palpable. The renovations were almost complete, but there were still small details that needed to be resolved. George monitored every step of the process, ensuring everything was done on time. Rachel, for her part, was exhausted but determined. She knew she couldn't give up now, not after all the effort they had made to save the NGO. George's decision to buy the building was the turning point the NGO desperately needed. With the purchase, they had the assurance that the shelter would continue operating without the constant threat of eviction. For Rachel, it felt like the weight on her shoulders had finally lifted. The security of having a permanent location energized the team, and the building renovations quickly began. Even so, Rachel knew they needed more than just a safe space. They needed a solid structure to sustain their work in the long term. As the renovation progressed, George decided to focus on another front, ensuring ongoing financial support for the NGO. He knew that the organization's success wouldn't depend solely on a renovation or temporary donations, but on lasting partnerships. George began reaching out to large companies, presenting Rachel's work and explaining the positive impact the NGO had on so many children's lives. His experience in convincing investors to believe in projects, coupled with his newfound belief in Rachel's cause, drove his efforts. Rachel, following George's advice, began documenting the stories of the children impacted by the NGO. She knew these stories could touch people's hearts and show the real impact of their work. One of the most moving testimonials was from Matthew, an 18-year-old who, at the age of 12, had been taken in by the NGO after living on the streets for months. Now, he was studying engineering and interning at a technology company. He frequently returned to the shelter to help other children and shared his story with gratitude for everything the NGO had done for him. Recording these testimonials was an emotional experience for Rachel. Each child had a journey marked by deep challenges, but the NGO was there to offer a second chance. Seeing the transformation in such young lives motivated Rachel to keep going. She knew her father would have been proud of what the NGO was becoming. The children's stories not only inspired others to get involved, but also reminded Rachel why she had never given up, even during the most difficult times. As the renovation of the building progressed, George was in constant contact with potential partners and donors. He knew that the support of large companies could secure the NGO's future. A supermarket chain expressed interest in creating internship programs for the young people from the NGO, and other companies began donating materials and supplies for the renovations. Slowly but surely, the NGO was being transformed into a success model with a much stronger foundation than before. Rachel watched all of this unfold with a mix of gratitude and admiration. George hadn't just offered money. He had become deeply involved, using his skills and contacts to build something lasting. She knew the NGO wouldn't have come this far without him, but she also knew that together, they were building something much bigger than a shelter. It was a place of hope and renewal where children could not only survive but thrive. Despite the advances, the pressure remained. The government, still pressured by the initial complaint, insisted that the final building inspection take place within the set deadline. If the inspection wasn't passed, the NGO could be temporarily shut down, something Rachel and George couldn't allow. The children depended on that place, and any disruption to the organization's activities would be devastating for them. Rachel knew they couldn't lose focus, even with all the victories they had already achieved. George, who had always maintained a calm demeanor in the face of challenges, knew there was still much to be done. He talked daily with the engineers and architects to ensure the renovations would be completed on time. At the same time, he continued his work seeking more support. More and more companies and donors were becoming interested in the NGO, motivated by the children's stories and the way Rachel and her team were changing lives. Whenever Rachel felt overwhelmed, she would watch the children's testimonials again. This renewed her strength and reminded her of why everything they were doing was so important. She knew that with the right support, they could continue expanding the NGO and helping more and more children. Her confidence grew with each passing day, but the shadow of the final inspection still hung over them. If they couldn't pass it, all their effort could be for nothing. However, Rachel and George were ready to face any obstacle. They had overcome so many challenges by that point that nothing seemed impossible. The NGO was already a symbol of overcoming and resilience, and each new partnership formed brought more hope for the future. Rachel finally felt she was living up to her father's legacy. She was ready to carry on his mission and continue saving lives, one child at a time. The day of the final inspection was drawing near, and George and Rachel were making the final adjustments to the building. The engineers were optimistic that everything would be ready in time, and Rachel knew that this time, they were more prepared than ever. What once seemed like an impossible struggle was now a journey of transformation, both for the NGO and for herself. The support of George, combined with her own strength and determination, had created something far greater than she could have imagined. The day of the inspection finally arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension. The NGO was fully prepared, the renovations were complete, and everything seemed in place, but Rachel's anxiety was almost overwhelming. George, standing beside her, maintained his usual calm demeanor, though he too felt the weight of the moment. They had worked tirelessly to ensure that everything met the standards, but uncertainty always accompanied challenges of this magnitude. The children were temporarily relocated while government inspectors toured the building, scrutinizing every detail with critical eyes. With each room that passed inspection, Rachel's breath seemed to pause for a moment. George, always a steady presence at her side, knew that this was one of the most pivotal moments of their lives. It wasn't just the future of the NGO at stake, but the future of the children who relied on it for a dignified life. They watched in silence as the inspectors discussed among themselves, taking notes and pointing out minor details. Rachel clasped her hands tightly, fighting the nervousness that grew with each passing second. After what felt like hours, the inspectors gathered and called Rachel and George for their verdict. The lead inspector, with a neutral expression, approached them, and for a brief moment, Rachel's heart seemed to stop. The building passed the inspection. The renovations were well executed, and everything is in compliance with safety regulations, he said. Those words brought an immediate wave of relief, and Rachel couldn't hold back her tears of joy. All the pressure, exhaustion, and fear were replaced by a surge of happiness and gratitude. She had done it. George smiled slightly, watching Rachel as she tried to process everything that had just happened. "I knew we'd make it," he said with a calm look. Rachel turned to him, her eyes full of tears, feeling a deep gratitude, not just for his support, but for his constant presence throughout the journey. He had been an anchor amidst the chaos, and now they stood there together, celebrating a victory that wasn't just about the building, but about overcoming the adversity that had nearly brought them down. In the months that followed, the NGO not only continued to operate but flourished like never before. With the inspection approved and the renovations complete, the facility became a safe and welcoming environment for the children, and the number of donors and partners grew significantly. Companies that had previously been unaware of the NGO's existence began to get involved, offering financial support and even internship programs for the young people. Rachel felt that, for the first time in months, her father's work was being recognized in the way he had always dreamed. George, though still involved, began to gradually step back. He knew the NGO was in good hands with Rachel and her dedicated team, and he felt that his role there was complete. He didn't seek public recognition for what he had done, but the satisfaction of having helped transform so many lives filled him in a way he hadn't expected. He had found something more valuable than the financial success he had always pursued, the real impact his actions had on others' lives. On the last day George visited the NGO, Rachel accompanied him to the door. They walked together in silence for a few minutes until Rachel, her voice soft, said, "I don't have words to thank you for what you did for us, George. You saved this place, saved these children, and helped me believe it was possible." George smiled gently, with the calm of someone who knew he had done something meaningful. "You would have made it on your own, Rachel. I just gave you a little push. The credit is all yours," he replied. Rachel knew he was being modest, but she also knew that she wouldn't have succeeded without his help. As George prepared to leave, she watched him with gratitude. He had appeared in her life at the most difficult moment, and together they had overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Now, the NGO was in a solid place, ready to grow even more, and Rachel knew she could carry on her father's legacy with the same strength and determination. As Rachel watched George walk away, she felt a mix of emotions. It was the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a new phase for the NGO. She turned her gaze to the renovated building and realized how it reflected the transformation that had taken place within her. The struggle, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, everything had been worth it. She had rediscovered her strength and, with George's support, had saved her father's dream and secured a future for the children. In the days that followed, life at the NGO returned to normal, but there was a significant difference. Rachel and her team's renewed confidence. The children continued to arrive, each with a difficult story, but now there was more hope in the air. Every child was welcomed with the same care and dedication that had always defined the NGO's work, but now there was a stronger foundation to continue. Rachel knew the future would still bring challenges, but she was ready to face them. And so, the work of the NGO moved forward, helping not only the children who lived there, but also inspiring other organizations to do the same. Rachel continued her mission with a heart full of gratitude and determination, knowing that, even in the hardest moments, there is always a way to keep going. She had learned that with the right support, anything is possible, and that true strength comes from never giving up on what's important. George, for his part, continued to follow the NGO's progress from a distance, proud of everything they had accomplished together. He knew that, although his active role had ended, he would always be part of that story. And deep down, he also knew that the journey had changed him forever.